Ansel, every Chaos God in Warhammer 40K has a portfolio, a backstory, a relationship to the others, and actual narrative weight. They manipulate galactic events, corrupt entire civilizations, and fight wars that span millennia. Ansel has spikes. That's basically it. He is listed among the Chaos Gods of the 3rd edition Chaos Space Marine Codex, and Chaos Space Marines were rumored to praise them by putting spikes on their power armor. Each spike was treated as a devotional offering, a prayer driven into ceramite, and the Codex mentioned them in association with armor modifications by Chaos Space Marines. So you're looking at a deity whose primary worship act is aggressive jewelry, enshrined in a rulebook alongside gods who actually move the plot of the setting. Chaos Space Marine models in 3rd edition were built with a level of conversion work that made every miniature a theological statement. Extra horns, rivets, skulls, and chains, each one pointed toward a specific chaos god. Khorne got the axes and blood. Tzeentch got the mutations and brighter, arcane-looking bits. Nurgle got the rot and the bulges. Slaanesh got the smooth curves and extra finery. But the spiky bits rule, the one that rewarded you in points for sheer coverage of sharp protruding objects, pointed to something else. Ansel. And alongside him, 2 other names that appear almost nowhere else in Warhammer canon. Mork and Fraz-Itar. 3 gods whose entire mythos can be summarized as the guys who like spikes. And that's where the explanation gets thin. You can map out every other Chaos God's origin, their role in the Great Game, their relationship to the mortal galaxy, their presence in Black Library novels across dozens of titles. Ansel has a pun. His name is a near-exact phonetic match for Brian Ansel, co-founder of Games Workshop and Citadel Miniatures. The man who, more than almost anyone else, built the physical hobby that Warhammer 40K lives on. It's impossible to read the name without hearing it, and once you hear it, the alternative explanation, that this is a genuine deity with a genuine portfolio consisting entirely of aggressive surface ornamentation, becomes very hard to take seriously. This is almost certainly a developer Easter egg. A private joke from one of the Codex writers that somehow survived editorial review and made it into a published rulebook. Here's the thing. There's no official statement confirming the pun. No interview, no FAQ, no writer's note. It could be coincidence, and defenders of that position can point out that Chaos God names are often deliberately harsh and unpronounceable. Ansel fits the aesthetic perfectly well without requiring any real-world reference. But the coincidence is doing so much heavy lifting there. The aesthetic of Chaos names is intentionally guttural and truncated, yes, but not typically that specific. And the fact that the name lands exactly on the surname of the most prominent figure in the company's early history, attached to a god whose only defining trait is a hobbyist concern, makes the alternative explanation feel like a stretch designed to protect a mystery that probably isn't there. The deeper question this raises isn't about Ansel specifically, it's about how Warhammer 40K's canon actually gets built. The setting has been running since 1987. Thousands of writers, artists, game designers, and hobbyists have contributed to it across rulebooks, novels, codices, and White Dwarf articles. Most of them cared deeply, some of them clearly didn't, or at least cared about something else in the moment. Ansel is proof that a throwaway joke from a Codex writer in the early 2000s can survive into canon simply because nobody ever bothered to remove it. The setting's lore isn't a monolith authored by a single vision, it's an accretion, layer upon layer of genuine mythology sitting directly on top of someone's offhand pun, and both occupy the same rulebook with the same official weight. Morkic. If Ansel is a pun that escaped into canon, Mork takes it several steps further. A name so phonetically broken it sounds less like a deity and more like someone testing the lower bounds of what qualifies as a word. The spiky bits rule in the 3rd edition Chaos Codex didn't just invoke one obscure god, it invoked 3, Ansel, Mork, and Fraz-Itar, grouped together as the divine patrons of aggressive armor modification. And Ansel, Mork, and Fraz-Itar are minor chaos deities mentioned in the 3rd edition Codex, showing up independently on 1d6chan's Chaos Gods article, then on 2d4chan's, each time grouped with the same pair of companions, each time listed as a Warhammer 40K entity with no apparent origin beyond that initial Codex mention. The 3rd edition Chaos Codex is doing real work here. It's not just name-dropping these entities in flavor text, they're embedded in the actual game mechanics. The spiky bits rule assigned point values to different armor modifications, and each modification category was associated with a specific divine patron. These deities appear as obscure references tied to the tradition of spiked Chaos Space Marine armor. That's game mechanical weight for a deity whose name reads like a keyboard smash, attached to a portfolio that consists entirely of sharp metal accessories on plastic miniatures. The Codex treated this with sufficient seriousness to put it in the rules. Not in a sidebar, in the rules. And yet there's nothing else. Mork has no known appearances in Black Library novels, no later codex references him, no official artwork, no model release, no narrative appearance in any edition after 3rd. He appears in the 3rd edition Chaos Codex and is referenced in later reference works such as Lexicanum, the Spiky Bits table, and is listed on fan reference wikis. He is, by every measure of Warhammer's actual canon, a deity who was written into a rulebook as a joke, given mechanical function, and then never touched again. Not expanded, not retconned, not even formally removed, just left there, dormant, waiting for the wikis to pick him up and carry him forward. What makes this genuinely strange is that the Spiky Bits rule wasn't a throwaway line. It was a structured mechanic with point costs and classification categories, which means an unknown number of actual players across actual game stores made actual decisions about their army lists based on which chaos god their model's spikes were pleasing. There's no way to know how many, or where, or whether any of them ever noticed that the god they were sacrificing list-building efficiency to had a name that sounded like it was generated by rolling a d20 on a consonant table. But the structural fact remains, a developer's private joke had real mechanical consequences for real players, and those players treated it with the same strategic seriousness they gave to every other element of their army list. The human strangeness of it is this. Across the world in hobby shops and basements and dining tables cleared for battle, players argued about list composition, spike density, and competitive viability. Some of those arguments were about Mork. They didn't know it. The Codex didn't tell them. But every time someone decided to load up a Devastator squad with extra spikes because the points math worked out, they were making an offering to a deity whose name reads like a keyboard smash. That's the weird alchemy of Warhammer canon, developer jokes becoming sacred text, fan wikis canonizing throwaway lines, and a name that sounds like nonsense accruing enough weight over 20 years that it now has a coherent, if extremely thin, place in the setting. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which god you think was the most absurdly specific. Let's get back into it. Fraz-Itar. Where Mork barely registers even on the fringes of the Warhammer community, Fraz-Itar stakes out something far stranger, a minor chaos god that actually exists in official material, however briefly. Fraz-Itar is a minor chaos god referenced in the 3rd edition Chaos Codex. The name is believed to be a pun on Frank Frazetta, the renowned fantasy artist. It's the kind of joke that only works if you know the reference, and Fraz-Itar is mentioned only briefly as a minor chaos deity, and is otherwise absent from the rest of Warhammer 40,000 canon. No writer has ever expanded on what it means to be the god of spiky bits, what its desires are, who its worshippers might be, or whether the pun was even intentional on the part of the person who wrote it. It is grouped with other named minor chaos gods, though only as a brief mention. The skeptic will say that a single throwaway joke in one edition doesn't make something a real deity, and on its own, that's a fair complaint. Fraz-Itar has no expanded lore, no miniature, no named character, no faction ability, nothing beyond that one codex entry. But it's listed on Lexicanum alongside Mork and Ansel as minor chaos gods. The 3rd edition Chaos Codex is official Games Workshop material and is the only source for Fraz-Itar. Nightbringer. The previous god was obscure by accident. This one was designed to be feared before language even existed to name that fear. The Nightbringer, also known as Ozagorod, is a star god of death older than the Necron civilization. The Aeldari know it as Kalis Ra, the destroyer of light, a name that predates their civilization's fall and stretches back into a continuity of reincarnation cycles longer than any other living race can trace. The Necron tier discovered the Nightbringer feeding on a star that devastated their homeworlds. When the Nightbringer took physical form, it discovered the life force of mortals was superior to that of stars and began to prey on them. The Nightbringer became the first Catan to enter a living metal body and reveled in death and destruction during the War in Heaven. During the Necron revolt, the Nightbringer was shattered into fragments and survives only as shards, and that is the small version of the problem. The Nightbringer existed before and during the rise of Necron civilization. The Necrons shattered the Nightbringer and scattered its shards across the galaxy. The skeptic will say that fear of death is universal and needs no cosmic architect, that every species independently develops terror of the dark, and that the Nightbringer is just a Necron story to justify the weapons they used. The Eldar, also called Aeldari, named the Nightbringer Kalis Ra. The Necrons destroyed the Nightbringer, but its shards remain, bound within living metal Necron constructs. The Nightbringer remains known throughout the galaxy as an ancient terror. Nobody has ever been able to explain why every species in the galaxy fears the same thing: Deceiver. You know the Nightbringer, Azagorod, the hungering star god who taught the universe to fear the dark. That's raw destructive power made manifest, a force so absolute it made an entire species willing to sell their souls just to survive it. At least Azagorod wore his cruelty openly, honestly, in a way. The Deceiver was different, and that's precisely what made him the most dangerous Catan the galaxy has ever produced. Known by innumerable names to species across 1,000,000 worlds, known as Mephetran to those who knew its true name, this was the star god who broke an entire civilization not through might, but through deception. This was the weakest Catan in personal power, measured against the Nightbringer's cosmic hunger or the Void Dragon's stellar devastation. Raw combat, he couldn't compete. What he had instead was influence, possibly the greatest of any Catan, and he wielded it with cold patience across 60 million years. When the Necron tier stood at the precipice, their stars dying, their lives shortening, the Deceiver stepped forward with a promised eternal life and power beyond anything they could conceive. The Necron tier agreed. It was the worst decision any species has ever made. Instead of eternal life, they received the biotransference, a transformation into the deathless Necrons, trapped in a state of half-life, robbed of will and identity. Every Necron that has ever marched across a battlefield is proof of one god's lie. And then it gets worse. Because the Deceiver didn't just betray the Necron tier once. He used them as currency. He traded and bartered the lives of his thralls with other Catan to secure their allegiance or stave off their wrath, orchestrating an internecine war among the star gods, decimating their own kind in a spiral of betrayal, and the Deceiver was one of those four, not because he was strongest, but because he made certain everyone else destroyed themselves first. After awakening in recent millennia, he orchestrated schemes that plunged the Gothic sector into open war, orchestrating schemes of staggering scope across the stars. The Necron tier gave up their minds to the gods of death and received nothing but eternal imprisonment in a walking corpse. Void Dragon. Magladroth shouldn't even be possible under the rules the Deceiver set. If the weakest Catan could break the galaxy, what does that make the one described as the greatest and most terrible of them all? Born more than 65 million years ago, the Void Dragon was a master of the material realm whose warriors were practically invincible, channeling raw lightning into their foes as they carved through anything the Old Ones set against them. When this entity fed on stars, it took the form of a cloud of dark light pouring across entire systems. The Eldar didn't just fear it, they built weapons specifically to contain it. The Eldar god of the Forge, Vol, created the talismans of Vol, the structures the Imperium now calls Blackstone fortresses, as the only means of attacking the Void Dragon at its source, which tells you everything about how cosmically terrifying this god actually was. The Void Dragon could channel raw, unrefined Blackstone in ways no other Catan could match, the most technologically advanced of all the star gods, and it embedded warp suppression pylons deep into the material realm to block the Old One's source of psychic power. Weapons so fundamental that the Necron Empire still relies on their logic millennia later. When it died during the Necron Revolt 65 million years ago, it shattered into shards, and even that fragmentation didn't end the threat. A shard broke free on the Eldar maiden world of Silentia in 912. M41 and laid waste to a dozen worlds before the Imperium and Eldar combined could force it back into containment. The Dragon's portfolio, destruction, mastery over machines, technology, is written into the structural DNA of the entire Necron civilization, from the most basic Canoptech construct to the greatest tomb world. There may even be a connection between Magladroth and the Dragon of Mars, the entity the Emperor imprisoned beneath the Red Planet, though whether the Emperor actually sealed a Catan shard there or something older remains one of the setting's great unresolved questions. And on the miniature itself, the lore is specific. The Canoptech construct controlling the Void Dragon's shard has its claws positioned to strike the essence if it seeks to escape. That's not flavor text. That's a fail-safe designed into the model's actual narrative, a mechanism built for one purpose, by one species, to contain a god. The Necron tier didn't fear this Catan because of its reputation alone. They feared it because it represented something they could not fight, could not reason with, could not defeat except by trapping it in stone and binding it through geometry and sorcery. The Necron civilization is fundamentally a cage, built by a dying species in a desperate bargain with hungry gods, held together by pylons and blackstone, and maintained by constructs that are themselves designed as failsafes. The Catan in their lore are less gods than they are natural disasters that learn to speak. The reason the models, the stories, the entire 40K Necron aesthetic circles back to containment and control, over and over, is that Games Workshop designed a faction built around imprisoned cosmic horrors from the start. The narrative and the tabletop were never separate. Every Necron player is controlling a weapon forged to keep a god locked in a cage, and they're the only thing standing between that god and the rest of the galaxy. Burning One. The Void Dragon is one thing, a single imprisoned entity contained in a vault on Mars, its destructive potential held in check by a single fragile seal. The Burning One is worse. It doesn't confine its destruction to one locked chamber. It eats everything around it, and what surrounds a Catan is everything. Stars, systems, whatever happens to be within reach of its hunger. Other Catan, such as the Deceiver and Nightbringer, are depicted as having distinct personalities and agendas. Nyadrazatha is known mainly through fan theory and speculative sources, not official canon. The Catan are ancient star gods described as powerful entities, but their origin is left ambiguous in canon. The Necrontyr forged physical bodies for the Catan, anchoring them in material reality. The Necrontyr traded their existence to the Catan, seeking power to use them as weapons. The Catan are capable of consuming stellar energy, impacting systems they encounter. The legends speak of the Catan leaving devastation in their wake. The Necrontyr imprisoned the Catan in advanced containment devices called Tesseract Labyrinths. Building that prison was an admission. Even the star-devouring gods were not fully under their control. Catan are said to have been shattered during the War in Heaven, resulting in their current fragmented state. If the Nightbringer and the Deceiver could be pinned down and fought, and if the Void Dragon could be contained beneath a planetary crust, the Burning One was the one that made even the Necrontyr build a box they hoped would hold forever. And the implication the facts force is straightforward. It was the first one locked up for a reason, which means it was the one that scared them most, and the galaxy is already full of its leavings. Morai Heg. Where the Burning One is a Catan star god, a force of pure cosmic appetite made flesh, Morai Heg is the crone goddess of fate in the Aeldari pantheon, the mother of banshees, believed to hold the right to sever the silvered cord joining soul and body. She appears as a withered ancient creature, the Crow Lady, the mistress of fate, and is said to hold the fate of mortals inside a rune pouch. Morai Heg is central in Aeldari mythology, and is credited with wisdom and insight over fate, influencing divine matters. Fate, she told them, was her domain alone. And she guarded that domain with a specificity that reads less like myth and more like engineering. Morai Heg's 5 severed fingers are said to have become the Crone Swords, relics important to the resurrection of Ynead. The Crone Swords are relics associated with the rebirth of Ynead. After the fall, the Eldar homeworlds became known as Crone Worlds, named for Morai Heg. Craftworld Yggdrasil is notable for continued devotion to her. The Torque of Morai Heg is a relic capable of clouding an enemy's thoughts and affecting sensors. Some attribute the gradual crystallization of aged farseers to Morai Heg, which raises the number that doesn't quite add up. 5 Crone Swords, 5 Crone Worlds, each scattered across the galaxy. The ordinary explanation treats these as independent traditions. Different craft worlds honoring different aspects of a pantheon, smith gods forging weapons, fallback worship on Yggdrasil. But that would require at least 5 separate cults independently preserving 5 distinct artifacts tied to the same goddess across 5 worlds, each cult coincidentally using the same number, coincidentally agreeing on the same figure, coincidentally surviving the fall in the same scattered pattern. And the condition isn't met. The Crone Swords come from Morai Heg's fingers, the Crone Worlds are named for her, and Yggdrasil retains her worship. 5 fingers became 5 blades by Val's command. A goddess of fate doesn't scatter by accident. The Crone Worlds are not shrines to a dead goddess. They are the body of one, broken into pieces, each piece still capable of deciding who lives and who dies. Kernus. He is the god of the hunt, and the gift he gave the Aeldari was the gift of desire and body, the same gift that would build their civilization across 100,000 years, and also poison it into extinction. He and Isha together provided the mortal form that Asurian had withheld, the physical flesh that let the Aeldari walk among the stars, love, build, and eventually reach the psychic threshold where their collective mind would detonate and birth a new god of chaos. Cernus saw every step of it. His sight was flawless. He watched the Aeldari spiral into hedonistic ruin, sensed the warp storm gathering around their homeworld, and saw Slaanesh coalescing, a newborn entity of limitless hunger and cruelty, born directly from the accumulated excess of the very people Cernus had fathered. He saw it all. Khaine, though, had made sure he could do nothing with what he saw. Khaine confined Cernus and Isha and made them endure constant fiery torment until Vol the Smith petitioned for their release. The entire Aeldari civilization was doomed, and their father god watched the end of it through crystal-clear eyes that were, at that exact moment, on fire. Nobody investigated, nobody intervened. Character motivation didn't matter. Cernus was devoured by Slaanesh during the fall, along with most of the Aeldari pantheon. Here's where it gets desperate. Slaanesh remembered that Cernus had seen everything. Every hideous distortion, every perversion, every moment of the birth that was also a murder, witnessed by the one god whose entire identity was rooted in perfect sight. The newborn Chaos God couldn't abide being witnessed in that state. Slaanesh devoured Cernus, along with the rest of the Aeldari pantheon. Cernus is still occasionally invoked, and the Harlequins describe themselves as his hounds, sent to the hunt. The dim green moon of the Eldar homeworld was named for Cernus, and nicknamed the Hunter's Moon, and where the Harlequins describe themselves as Cernus's hounds, unleashed on an eternal hunt that outlasted the hunter himself. Cernus suffered fiery torment alongside Isha for countless years, before Vol secured their freedom. The Aeldari pantheon didn't just die during the fall. It got destroyed in ways that were specific, personal, and designed around each god's defining trait. Cernus's defining trait was sight, so Slaanesh destroyed it with surgical cruelty, eyes removed and scattered like debris. The category isn't gods who fell. It's gods who were unmade by the exact thing that made them gods, turned into artifacts that outlast their owners by millennia. Every Aeldari carrying a shard of his eyes into battle is carrying proof that some deaths don't end with the body. Isha. She is the goddess of life and healing, the fertility and harvest made divine, and alongside her daughter Lilith, she stands among the very few genuinely benevolent entities in the entire warp, a category so small it can be counted on the fingers of one hand, which makes the cruelty of her fate land that much harder. The spirit stones carried by Aeldari warriors, which house a dying warrior's soul, are known as Isha's tears. When Khaine demanded the complete destruction of the Aeldari race over Lilith's prophecy of a mortal army that would one day shatter him, Asuryan created the barrier that separated gods from mortals and handed Isha and Cernus directly over to Khaine as punishment for defying it. Isha met her people in secret, nursed them, spoke to them through the barriers Asuryan had erected, and for that she was chained, tortured, imprisoned alongside her husband for years that stretched beyond counting, until Vol the Smith God bargained for their freedom with a promise of 100 swords forged in a single year. Vol delivered 99, and the 100th was a mortal blade substituted in place of a true god-forged weapon. The bargain held. Isha and Cernus walked free. Briefly. The fall of the Aeldari Empire should have killed her like it killed every other god in the pantheon. It didn't. When Slaanesh was born and the Aeldari race was consumed by its hunger, Isha somehow endured the birth slaughter, the same cataclysm that obliterated Cernus, Asuryan, Vol, and every other divine being tied to the Aeldari people. She survived it, and then Slaanesh seized her. She became his eternal captive, held in captivity by Slaanesh for ages before coming to dwell with Nurgle. Then Nurgle heard her. The god of plagues, decay, and despair somehow perceived her suffering across the warp, and something moved in him that wasn't the usual Chaos God self-interest. He took her as his own, and she now willingly resides with him. Among the many tales woven around Isha, one account from Aeldari mythology describes a dire bargain struck to preserve her people from extinction. Fulgrim, at that point in the narrative, was deep into the corruption that would see him transformed into a daemon prince of Slaanesh, a being whose relationship to truth had become, to put it generously, flexible. The claim is not treated as reliable by the broader canon, but the fact that it exists at all, attributed to that specific voice in that specific book, tells you something about the kind of figure Isha has become in the setting. A goddess whose suffering is so extreme, so foundational to the Aeldari mythos, that even unreliable narrators can't stop invoking it. The Aeldari gods didn't die during the fall. They were unmade, consumed, recycled. And Isha is living proof of what the warp does when it gets its hands on something that actually deserves to survive. Asuryan, the Phoenix King, the All-Seeing, the Great Pillar of the Heavens. Every title Eldar civilization ever minted pointed in the same direction, and that direction was Asuryan, the eldest of all their gods, the one who sat higher than every other power in the pantheon before any of them had even drawn breath. He wasn't merely first among equals, he was first among an infinite set, the father of gods and ancestor of every living thing the Eldar would ever breed, the god who gave them the twin gifts of wisdom and introspection that would ultimately be their salvation and their curse in equal measure. Where Isha's story ended in chains and silence, Asuryan's arc ran in the opposite direction, toward decisions so large they bent the architecture of reality itself. His greatest act was the construction of the Great Barrier, a wall thrown up between the realm of the gods and the world of mortals that would stand for all eternity. He raised it after learning that Khaine, his brother god, planned to massacre the Eldar people, and in raising it, Asuryan made a choice no other Eldar deity would ever have the courage to repeat. He refused to take sides. When the war in heaven consumed everything, when the Ingir turned their cold wrath against the newborn gods, Asuryan watched the devastation unfold and despaired at it. But he did not move. He remained as lord of both sides, the impartial pillar holding heaven together, while his siblings tore each other apart. That restraint would define him above all else. His power was not abstract. It was measurable in the damage he could do to things that should have been unkillable. When Asuryan demonstrated power over the cosmos itself during the war in heaven, an act remembered in Eldar legend. When the fall came, Asuryan met a different kind of end. His destruction produced the Tears of Asuryan, a catastrophically dangerous relic tied to the birth of Slaanesh. Slaanesh consumed him, devoured his power, scattered his essence. And still, a fragment survived. A remnant of the Phoenix King's power endures within the Craftworlds. Asurman, the first Phoenix Lord, carried his standard across 1,000 battlefields and built the path system in his honor, giving the Eldar a framework for discipline that the gods themselves had never managed. Without Asuryan, there are no Phoenix Lords. Without the Phoenix Lords, there is no Craftworld method of survival. But the specialist's objection arrives now, because Asuryan's story invites a very specific reading from anyone who knows the Eldar well enough to read between the lines. His barrier, his defining act, looks like abandonment to the careful reader. He built a wall between gods and mortals after the Khaine incident, and that wall stayed up. He never came down to fight in the war in heaven, never chose a side, never intervened to protect his own people when they needed him most. He is the god who sat on his hands while everything fell apart. And it is a fair reading, until you account for what the alternative actually looked like. The war in heaven was a conflict so total that the Ingir were exterminating entire pantheons. The gods who charged into it died. The gods who picked sides died. Asuryan's restraint wasn't cowardice and it wasn't indifference. It was the only strategy that let him survive long enough for his people to endure. His barrier didn't just separate gods from mortals, it separated the gods from Slaanesh, before Slaanesh had fully manifested. The wall bought time, it didn't buy enough. That is what the facts force. The greatest god the Eldar ever had, the one who could rearrange stars and curse the hands of his brother with eternal blood, could not prevent the fall. His barrier held, his people did not. Khaine. If Asuryan was the god-king archetype, the elder, the wise, the father sitting on a pillar, Khaine was something that wore the shape of a god, but bore no resemblance to any deity anyone would recognize from a functional pantheon. He was the Lord of Murder, second only to Asuryan in raw power, and infinitely his inferior, in everything that prevents a civilization from eating itself. Where his elder brother gave the Eldar wisdom, Khaine gave them the fire of war and the cold logic of the blade. Where Asuryan looked at a universe that was destroying itself and built a wall, Khaine looked at the same universe and sharpened his knives. His origin myth is the Eldar's most brutal lesson in what happens when power meets impulse. Before the war in heaven, before any of the great conflicts that would define Eldar history, Khaine slew Eldanesh, their people's first great hero, out of nothing more complicated than jealousy. Asuryan cursed him for it, and that curse was permanent, absolute, and deeply specific. From that moment forward, Khaine's hands would forever drip with Eldanesh's blood. The title Kala Mensha, bloody-handed, was not a metaphor. It was a brand, stamped onto the most violent thing in the Eldar cosmos, visible to any who bothered to look. That curse was not merely decorative. Every drop of blood Khaine ever shed, every massacre he blessed, every war he stoked, was already accounted for in that first act of pointless killing, which made every subsequent act not a choice but a fulfillment. When the war in heaven erupted, Khaine squared off against the Nightbringer and shattered its necrodermis, but the shrapnel from that broken shell pierced his own flesh, and the dying machine god's curse tainted him with the aspect of the Reaper. He had beaten the Nightbringer, but the victory left a mark that no healing could touch. And when Isha and Kurnus defied Asuryan's orders and descended to mortal affairs, the Phoenix King delivered them to Khaine for punishment. He captured them, he tortured them. When the fall came, when the Eldar Empire's decadence birthed She Who Thirsts, and Slaanesh rose screaming into the warp, Khaine was one of only 2 gods in the entire pantheon who did not die that day. He survived through might alone. Every other deity, Isha, Kurnus, Asuryan himself, was consumed, shattered, or destroyed. But the Lord of Murder, the god who had been dripping Eldanesh's blood since before the stars were old, was something Slaanesh could kill, but not finish. Slaanesh shattered him, yes, scattered his essence into 1,000 fragments that fled across the warp. But the pieces survived. Those fragments found their way to every craftworld afloat in the void, embedding themselves in the heart of each world ship like a splinter in living flesh. They have been there ever since, and they are the source of everything the Aeldari are as a warrior people. The Aspect Warriors, those stunning, single-minded killers who dedicate every moment of their long lives to a single form of combat, do not merely honor Khaine, they are born from him. Each aspect is a facet of his shattered soul. The Howling Banshee's speed, the Dark Reaper's precision, the Striking Scorpion's stealth, the Fire Dragon's hatred of the solid, the Harlequin's deadly dance. The darker aspects of his nature mirror the destructive impulses within the Eldar soul. The Kadai are the gods of the heavens, lords of destiny and the higher aspects of the Eldar spirit. He was always the god of both the blade and the wound, the strike and the agony, and neither part of him ever went away. The specialist's objection here is the one anyone who has read the Black Library novels will already be forming. The official explanation is almost too neat. Each craftworld, we are told, holds a shard of Khaine, and that shard can be summoned through the sacrifice of an exarch, an aspect warrior who has given over every scrap of their individuality to their chosen aspect, into an avatar of Khaine, a towering figure of molten wraithbone and murder that tears through enemy ranks with the Lord of Murder's own strength. That's the textbook answer. And it holds. It holds perfectly across rulebooks, novels, and the lore compendiums. But it doesn't hold when you look at what Khaine actually represents for the Aeldari, which is not worship in any meaningful sense. The Eldar do not pray to Khaine the way mortals pray to the Emperor. They do not build temples in his name or burn offerings to keep him appeased. What they do is channel him. The path system Asurman built in Asuryan's name, that intricate framework of discipline designed to give the Eldar's restless souls a structured outlet, has as its most volatile expression the warrior path, the one that leads straight to Khaine. Every aspect shrine is a valve, every exarch is a containment vessel. The Eldar are not worshipping a god of murder, they are managing one. They built their entire civilization around the principle that if you give Khaine enough structure, enough discipline, enough carefully controlled outlets, he won't burn the house down around you. And he almost did anyway. The fall proved that the structure was insufficient. Look at what walks out of an aspect shrine when the fire of Khaine is kindled. It stands 8 or more feet tall, wrapped in a shell of burning wraithbone that radiates heat enough to melt ceramite, wielding blades carved from the stuff of warp and starlight. It does not speak. It does not negotiate. It kills everything in its path, with a ferocity that no mortal mind could sustain, because it is not driven by mortal strategy. It is driven by the raw, distilled essence of a god who slew their people's first great hero out of jealousy, and never stopped killing since. When it falls, it dissolves into mist, and the shard that formed it returns to the Craftworld's core, waiting. Waiting for the next exarch to make the sacrifice. Waiting for the next war that needs a god of murder walking the battlefield. That is not worship. That is plumbing, and it is the only thing that has kept the Eldar alive in a universe that wants them dead. Cegorach. Every other god of the Eldar pantheon died screaming when Slaanesh tore the heart out of their civilization. Cegorach laughed. He's the only member of that entire pantheon to escape the fall completely unscathed, the sole survivor of a massacre that killed gods, and he did it by turning the apocalypse into a punchline. What makes that survival meaningful isn't just that he got away. It's what he's been doing ever since and the scale of it, because Cegorach doesn't just protect his own followers, he reaches across the warp into the maw of she who thirsts herself and pulls souls back out. His mythology runs through the full depth of Eldar legend. He gave the Aeldari the capacity for irony, the specific gift of finding humor in themselves as a defense against hubris, the very flaw that let Slaanesh creep into their civilization in the first place. In the ancient sagas, Cegorach stole Khaine's blade and oversaw the Wedding of Screams, an event that sounds more like a divine heist than a ceremony. During the War in Heaven, he and his soul dancers, the primordial Harlequins, pulled off what no other force could manage. They convinced the C'tan themselves to turn on each other. He tricked the outsider into consuming the other C'tan. And across all of it, his defining character is punishment for pride. Pranks and jokes directed at gods and mortals alike whenever either gets too full of themselves. The Harlequins are his chosen, and through them the true scope of Cegorach's defiance becomes clear. When Slaanesh swallowed the Eldar gods, legend holds that the Laughing God slipped away into the Webway as Khaine fell in combat against the newborn Chaos power. But here's where the standard account falls apart. Defenders will tell you Cegorach survived by staying distant from the decadence, that his mocking nature kept him clean of the corruption that felled every other deity, that he's been hiding basically for 10,000 years. He isn't hiding. Cegorach is the only being in the entire galaxy, in the entire warp, across all the factions and entities and powers that exist, who dares to defy Slaanesh directly. He doesn't just dodge the predator of souls. He goes after her. The Harlequins believe he walks among them from time to time in the guise of a player, and their most desperate prayers aren't for protection but for retrieval, because Cegorach will, on occasion, reach into Slaanesh's domain and wrest the souls of his servants back. The mechanism has never been explained. No one in the lore has been able to say how a being whose power base is the Webway can reach into the heart of the Chaos God's realm and pull something out. The fact that he can, and that he does, is simply accepted as part of the Laughing God's nature. But it raises a question no Black Library novel has ever answered. If Cegorach can rescue souls from Slaanesh's grasp, what exactly stops him from doing it at scale? And if he could free every Eldar soul trapped in the warp, why hasn't he? Gork and Mork. Where the previous god broke every rule of divine survival, the orc twin gods demonstrate that the rule was never real to begin with. Gork and Mork exist in a state that shouldn't be possible for any warp entity. They were born from the orcs rather than the other way around, which inverts the entire cosmology that governs how gods are supposed to work in the 40K setting. Every other power in the warp either predates the material species that worships it or emerged from a civilization's collective psychic imprint over millennia. Gork and Mork did both at once, and the result is a pair of deities that are as belligerent, as indestructible, and as genuinely warp-born as any entity in the galaxy. Vulcan witnessed them fighting at the beginning of time. That isn't a metaphor. During the War of the Beast, the Primarch was granted visions showing Gork and Mork locked in their eternal clash. The same conflict that the orcs have been reenacting across 1 million battlefields ever since. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka has received visions too, confirming that the orcoid species didn't just happen to grow in the image of the gods, but was shaped by them. Makari, the historical orc mystic, recorded similar revelations. The pattern across all these sources points to the same conclusion. The orcs were not made in anyone else's image. They were made in the image of Gork and Mork, in a place called the Great Green, their own warp realm, built entirely out of Wog energy, where the twin gods battle endlessly, and no being from the Materium or the Standard Warp could survive for a single second. The inversion is in the description itself. One god is brutally cunning and the other is cunningly brutal, but which is which depends entirely on perspective, and that ambiguity isn't an accident. The popular confusion treats Gork as the brute and Mork as the schemer, but that's backwards, and it's backwards on purpose. Gork is brutal yet cunning. He hits so hard your brains leak out before you can think. Mork is cunning yet brutal. He builds weapons that explode and kill friend and foe alike, because it doesn't care who gets crumped as long as something gets crumped. The point isn't to have two different gods. It's to have the same impulse expressed two ways, both arriving at the same result, and both of them being exactly what an orc already is. The distinction that actually holds is the caste line, not the personality line. Gork is the god regular boys worship, the manifestation of raw killing power, the one you're praying to when you're charging across a battlefield with a choppa in each hand. Mork is the god of the odd boys, the mechs who build increasingly unhinged machinery, and the weird boys whose heads channel lightning from nowhere. The split mirrors the orcoid species itself, the warrior caste and the specialist caste, both equally essential, both equally violent, both equally serving the same twin ends. No other pantheon in 40K has this kind of internal specialization built into its divine structure at the species level. The orcs didn't just invent gods. They invented a religion that functions as a perfectly calibrated biological amplifier, where every act of violence and every act of invention feeds back into the same psychic engine and makes both gods stronger. The design becomes clear when you look at what Gork and Mork actually do. They don't issue commandments, they don't demand worship in any conventional sense, they simply are the psychic reflection of a species that was built with no off switch. Every wound that heals, every vehicle that drives itself, every lightning bolt from a weird boy's head, every wah that rolls across a star system is the twin gods in action, doing exactly what they were made to do: keep the orcs fighting, keep them building, keep the cycle turning without end. They weren't designed to be worshipped, they were designed to be unstoppable. Khorne. If Gork and Mork were the universe's idea of gods, crude, hungry, defined by what they want next, then Khorne is what happens when that hunger stops being funny. The orcs' gods live in the warp like everything else, and they're simple: fight, eat, smash. Khorne is the same instinct, stripped of all limits and elevated to cosmic permanence. Every punch thrown, every skull cracked, every battle ever fought across the million worlds of the Imperium or the chaos waste beyond it doesn't just feed him. It is him. And unlike Gork or Mork, who can be outsmarted or outweighted, Khorne cannot be ignored. Violence is not his preference. It is the only currency that matters in his economy, and that economy runs whether you believe in him or not. His name is said to derive from the dark tongue word Karnith, meaning Lord of Rage, and everything about his nature flows from that root. He is the Lord of Battle, the Taker of Skulls, the great butcher seated upon a throne of brass atop a mountain of bleached bones that rises from a lake of blood. He wears red and black armor of brass and iron, his figure gargantuan, broad, muscle-packed beneath a snarling, hound-like countenance. He is rage-given mass, a physical force that exists in the warp and bleeds outward into reality with every gunshot and every swing of the chainsword, and every act of violence gives him power, not just the violence of his own followers, but the violence of his enemies. A guardsman killing a Chaos Marine in the name of the Emperor feeds Khorne just as surely as that Marine killing a guardsman feeds him. That is not a metaphor. In the logic of the warp, blood flows in one direction, and Khorne drinks it all. That is the first thing his followers must understand, no exceptions. Any worshipper who allows even a single day to pass without contributing to the bloodshed earns his lord's displeasure, and Khorne's punishments are not subtle. His followers are warriors who worship him on the battlefield rather than through temples. There are no temples because there is no need for them. The entire galaxy is his cathedral. His battle cry, chanted by world eaters with their skull-faced helmets and Khorne berserkers charging into the fray, is a ritual in 2 lines: blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. It is not a slogan, it is an accounting, and Khorne keeps accounts with terrifying precision. He hates Tzeentch, the architect of fate, with a genuine and fathomless loathing. Tzeentch's magic is deception, plotting, change, the opposite of the blunt physicality Khorne worships. But Khorne saves his purest hatred for Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess and pleasure, whose entire philosophy, sensation, aesthetic, refinement, is an affront to everything Khorne stands for. Their rivalry is the most visceral in the entire warp, not because they oppose each other tactically, but because they represent opposing answers to the same question, and Khorne cannot tolerate the answer that involves beauty, or pleasure, or anything softer than a fist wrapped around an axe. The number 8 governs everything he does. His legions are organized in powers of 8. 8 enormous towers ring the brass citadel that serves as his fortress palace in the warp, and his chosen champions always seek out battles worth 8 lives. It is a numerical obsession that reflects his fundamental nature. Khorne's power is structural, systematic, and martial. He is not a trickster god or a tempter. He is a war machine with a personality. Even on the fringes of the Imperium, his name echoes in mutated forms. Among the primitive inhabitants of Fenris, the great ice world where the space wolves make their fortress home, the primitive tribes of Fenris have their own dark deities, one of which is said to trace back to the time of the Great Crusade, when the Space Wolves under Leman Russ brought the Imperium's light to the ice world. It is a distorted echo of Khorne, refracted through the lens of Fenrisian superstition and the shadow of the greatest civil war the galaxy has ever seen, proof that even when people don't know his name, they recognize his face. Khorne's existence is a locked loop that requires no maintenance and accepts no compromise. He cannot be bargained with, no ritual contains him, no prayer convinces him to spare anyone. He simply is, and he grows, because the galaxy never stops fighting. And that is the single sentence worth repeating. Khorne is the only Chaos God who does not need you to believe in him. He only needs you to hit something. Emperor of Mankind. Where Khorne operates through raw proximity to violence, the Emperor operates through something far rarer and far heavier. Deliberate, sustained intention maintained across 10,000 years. He was born circa 8000 BC on Terra, in the Sol system, a perpetual, unaging, able to regenerate from wounds that would kill any mortal, and a psyker whose power dwarfs every other living thing in the galaxy. Every advantage Khorne has: infinite worshippers, self-sustaining power, no need for temples. The Emperor has the inverse. He has been an immobile corpse on the Golden Throne for 10 millennia, his shattered body held together by ancient technology and the sheer force of his will, sustained by the soul sacrifice of countless millions of psykers. It makes it worse, because it means every day of the last 10,000 years has been a choice made by others to keep a man they call a god barely breathing. He was not always a corpse. He was a conqueror who united the warring tribes of Terra, who launched the Great Crusade across the galaxy to reunite humanity scattered across a million worlds, who created the 20 Primarchs and the Space Marine Legions to be his instruments. He was the greatest psyker who ever lived, and his power was so vast that he could direct the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides Imperial vessels through the impossible distances of the warp, without a device, without ceremony, through force of will alone. His will extends across the hundreds of billions of worlds that make up the Imperium. His presence in the warp is a firewall, a psychic dam that holds back the Chaos Gods and prevents their intrusion into the material universe on anything like the scale that would end all human civilization. He is doing that right now. He has done it for 10,000 years. Every second of every day, the Emperor is the only thing standing between humanity and the four powers that want it consumed. The Horus Heresy engineered it. The four Chaos Gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, conspired together to corrupt the Emperor's favorite son, Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, and turned half of the 20 Primarchs against their father, half of his own sons. The final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit was not a battle, it was an execution, brutal and merciless, ending with the Emperor tearing Horus apart with his psychic might, and suffering a mortal wound in the process. He was carried back to Terra broken, placed upon the Golden Throne, and has not moved since, a corpse shackled to a machine that keeps him alive and keeps the Astronomicon burning simultaneously, because the technology has no off switch and he has no exit. He almost became one of them. In the final moments before facing Horus, and the reason he didn't is the most important detail in Warhammer 40,000's entire cosmology, and the Imperium's response was to make him a god anyway. The Emperor is worshipped as the divine sovereign of the Imperium, and it is illegal to be an atheist. The punishment is burning at the stake. His name is on every prayer, his symbol is on every flag, his will is cited as the justification for every crusade and every purge. He is the father and guardian of humanity, and his religious authority is absolute across a million worlds. And he absolutely hates every second of it. He built the Imperium specifically to protect humanity from the corruption of faith and worship, and the institution he founded to do that has become the single greatest engine of religious fanaticism the galaxy has ever seen. The very thing he fought against became the very thing that sustains the machinery keeping him alive. The sacrifice of psykers that powers the Golden Throne, the fanaticism that drives the Imperium's wars, the unquestioning obedience that allows the High Lords of Terra to rule in his name. The Emperor is not a god who demands worship. He is a man trapped inside a god's costume, and the costume has its own momentum. And that proves the category. Every god in Warhammer 40K, every Cegorach and Khaine and Khorne and Tzeentch, exists because something is feeding it. Belief, violence, magic, excess, death, whatever. The galaxy creates gods the way it creates weather, and they are not optional. But the Emperor is the only one who knew what he was getting into, who chose his role, who had the power to say no and, in the most important moment of his existence, almost did. He is the god who is also a warning. This is what happens when you try to save humanity from itself, and humanity responds by worshipping you so hard it keeps you alive in a state of permanent torture. He is proof that in the 41st millennium, even the most powerful being in existence is not above being misunderstood by the very people he sacrificed everything to protect. Tzeentch, no one in the setting has been manipulated more times, by more players, across more timelines, than the Emperor of Mankind himself. And the architect of that manipulation wasn't Khorne's butchers or Nurgle's plagues. It was Tzeentch, whose schemes span millennia, wove his influence across the heresy long before it exploded into open war. The Changer of Ways, the Master of Fortune, the Great Conspirator, the Architect of Fate. 4 titles for one entity, and each one describes a different weapon in the arsenal of the Chaos God, who embodies ambition, sorcery, and change itself. Tzeentch was not always a god. He emerged from the roiling currents of the warp when mortal species across the galaxy began dreaming of futures different from their present. Every plan, every fantasy of transformation, every whispered resolution to become something else fed raw power into a consciousness that had not yet coalesced into a god. That consciousness was Tzeentch, and the dreams of mortals remain his primary fuel source to this day. Tzeentch perceives every possible future simultaneously, not through prophecy in the conventional sense, but through direct awareness of every mortal mind that harbors ambition, scheme, or hope for change. Every psyker channeling warp energy in the Imperium, every Aeldari seer weaving fate through the Infinity Circuit, every human bureaucrat plotting a political maneuver, all of them broadcast their intentions into the warp, and Tzeentch receives every signal. He doesn't see the one future that will happen. He sees all of them, all at once. A cascading infinite lattice of possibility that shifts with every new mortal decision. His schemes are built on this vision, and they operate on timescales that dwarf any other entity in the setting. A Tzeentchian plot can span millennia, threading through 1,000 generations of conspirators who believe they're acting independently, each one a pawn who was recruited before they were born. The Horus Heresy, the galaxy-spanning civil war that destroyed the Emperor's dream of unified human empire and killed half his Primarch sons, was not a desperate gambit by the forces of chaos. It was a Tzeentchian masterpiece of long-game manipulation, corrupted at the root through years of whispered influence, planned long before Horus himself was chosen to lead it. His nature is literally encoded in his form. Tzeentch's body is a roiling mass of mutating flesh, skin that constantly shifts and rolls with faces that leer, express mockery, and whisper running commentary, each face a fragment of some mortal scheme he's consumed. He speaks through them all at once. His daemons, the multi-limbed Lord of Change, the ever-mouthing horrors, the winged screamers, and the flame-wreathed flamers, are creatures of pure magic given form, existing in the warp, in ways that bypass conventional physicality entirely. When Lord of Change daemons manifest in real space, they bring with them fragments of Tzeentch's infinite knowledge and rewrite local reality around them. The winds of change that Tzeentch commands flow through the warp, making him the Chaos God most closely tied to sorcery and psychic power. The instant a psyker reaches into the warp for power, Tzeentch already has a doorway into their mind. Tzeentch is not the god of destruction. He is the god of transformation, and that distinction is what makes him the most dangerous of the 4, because transformation is the quality that civilization depends on. Adaptation, cunning, the willingness to change. Every quality humanity calls its strength, Tzeentch calls his dinner. The system of Warhammer 40K is built so that the very traits that should allow survival, the drive to improve, to scheme, to evolve, are the precise mechanisms through which corruption enters. To fight Tzeentch is to deny change, and to deny change is to die. This is the trap the setting never lets anyone escape, and it's why Tzeentch's schemes never need to succeed in any single instance to be effective. They just need humanity to keep being humanity. Nurgle. If Tzeentch's influence seeps through the cracks of individual ambition, Nurgle's rot claims every surface the Imperium touches, every planet's crust, every starship's hull, every living body that draws breath in a galaxy that stopped being hospitable to life roughly 38,000 years ago. The Emperor's story turns on the question of whether humanity can transcend its physical limitations. Tzeentch answers that question by corrupting the desire to transcend. Nurgle answers it by claiming the physical form itself. He is the Plague Father, the Fly Lord, the Lord of Decay, the third of the four Chaos Gods to fully awaken, born not in the ancient past of the War in Heaven, but during Terra's own Middle Ages, when plagues swept across continents in the direct wake of his coalescence in the Warp. From the poisoned Forge worlds to the blighted hive cities of the 41st millennium, Nurgle's rot spreads across every world the Imperium touches. Nurgle's garden is his home in the Warp, a vast and vibrant landscape where rot and growth are indistinguishable from each other, where blighted trees bear luminous fruit and rivers of pus reflect a beautiful, sickly light. It is the only place in the Warp where the other Chaos Gods cannot easily follow, protected not by force but by the suffocating embrace of decay itself. His daemons, the Plague-bearers, the Nurglings, the Beast of Nurgle, the Great Unclean Ones, emerge from this garden carrying specific poxes, each named, each carrying a particular signature of suffering. The Death Guard, the corrupted Space Marine Legion led by Mortarion, carries the closest relationship to Nurgle of any major faction, their armor crusted with rust and filth, their bodies swollen with blight, their very existence a testament to what happens when a Primarch crashes into the Garden of Nurgle during the Horus Heresy and finds not corruption, but welcome. He coaxes worshippers not through promise of glory or power, but through the oldest and most honest bargain in the galaxy. He takes away the fear of death by making the dying process his own, wrapping the faithful in a warmth that feels indistinguishable from love. His followers call him Grandfather Nurgle, Papa Nurgle, Father Nurgle, and they mean it. The affection is not performative, not a mask over terror. Nurgle is genuinely paternal. He is the most involved of the four Chaos Gods with the actual lived experience of mortals, because he meets them where they are, exhausted, hurting, certain that existence is a slow dissolution they cannot stop. He offers comfort within that suffering rather than redemption from it, and the distinction matters enormously. Redemption requires that suffering be wrong, that it have a purpose, that it leads somewhere better. Nurgle's promise is simpler and more devastating. Your suffering is not wrong. It is real. It belongs to you, and I will give you peace within it. The Death Guard did not betray the Imperium out of ambition or resentment, at least not primarily. They chose Nurgle because he was the only power in the galaxy that didn't demand they stop hurting, and then punish them for the pain they couldn't control. Why this matters? Nurgle reveals that the most seductive corruption in 40K is not the temptation to dominate or destroy, but the offer to stop fighting. The galaxy punishes endurance. It exhausts every resource a person or civilization has, grinds it down over millennia, and then presents Nurgle as the only honest thing left. A god who doesn't lie about what existence costs, who simply gives you permission to stop paying it yourself. The Emperor demands purity. Tzeentch demands ambition. Khorne demands blood. Nurgle demands nothing except that you let go. That is why his plagues are eternal. Not because they are unstoppable, but because choosing them feels, for the first time in a brutal life, like a choice someone actually made. Slaanesh. If Nurgle is the slow rot that breaks empires over centuries, Slaanesh is the collapse that happens when an entire civilization decides to eat itself alive. Where Nurgle's gifts spread through despair and neglect, Slaanesh's dominion was engineered by the fall of the Eldar, an Aeldari civilization so consumed by excess and hedonism that its psychic devastation birthed a god and rent reality itself. The Dark Tongue tells the truth in its name. Sla. Ecstasy or pleasure, and Neth. Lord or prince, so prince of pleasure or lord of ecstasy depending on which tongue speaks it. The Aeldari, who felt its birth in their collective soulstone, call it she who thirsts, and the name carries more warning than flattery. The appearance alone signals a being that exists beyond human categories of gender. Slaanesh's form transcends all conventional boundaries, embodying every extreme of sensation and perfection in a shape that shifts and defies fixed categories. Its symbol fuses opposing elements into a single mark, embodying the transcendence of all boundaries between sensation and meaning. Purple and pink stain every surface associated with it, from the banners of its warbands to the demons that crawl from the warp to serve it. The birth of Slaanesh, at the climax of the fall of the Eldar, created the Eye of Terror, a warp rift that permanently scarred the galaxy and reshaped the laws of space travel across an enormous span. Every Eldar alive at that moment, with the exception of those positioned far beyond the Empire's core worlds or sealed deep inside the Webway's protected passages, had their souls ripped out and consumed. What remained were the Exodites on colony worlds too distant to be reached, the Craftworlds already racing for the galactic rim, and the dark kin who'd already learned to trade in stolen sensation rather than give themselves over to it. Slaanesh has spent the 10,000 years since making certain the Aeldari remember why they fear it. Every Craftworld carries an infinity circuit, a labyrinth of spirit stones designed to trap and protect Eldar souls from the Prince of Pleasure's appetite. But the Webway can only hold so much, and Slaanesh's reach extends into every unprotected corner of psychic space. The greatest of its daemons, the Keepers of Secrets, stalk the material realm as arbiters of excess, each one a whirlwind of sensation and perfection that drives mortals toward obsessions until they are nothing but hollow shells, pursuing something that can never satisfy. Slaanesh doesn't just want your soul. It wants every part of you that you've ever denied yourself, so it can spend it all at once and leave you with nothing. Here's the thing. Slaanesh isn't a god of sex. Not really. That's the version sold in 1,000 online summaries and half the community content out there. But the reality is both more interesting and more unsettling. The Prince of Pleasure governs every form of excess. Perfectionism pushed to the point where a single flaw becomes unbearable. Greed that accumulates wealth for no purpose beyond accumulation itself. Ambition that destroys every relationship in pursuit of a title that carries no power. Pain that is sought out because the intensity of sensation is the only thing that feels real anymore. The Keepers of Secrets don't seduce people into lust. They seduce them into obsession. Any obsession, so long as it consumes everything else. Slaanesh's enemies call it a hedonist's god. It isn't. It's the god that waits at the end of every hedonic treadmill, the point where pleasure stops being pleasure, and becomes the mechanism of your own destruction. Defenders, or rather, observers who haven't thought it through, will point to Slaanesh's rivalry with Khorne as proof that it stands for something opposite to violence. That's exactly backwards. Khorne is the god of martial discipline, of rage held within codes and hierarchies, of bloodshed that means something. Slaanesh is the collapse of all boundaries, including the boundary between pleasure and pain, which is why its relationship with Khorne is the most bitter in the entire warp. Khorne represents pain with purpose. Slaanesh represents pain stripped of all meaning, sensation drained of every reason except the act of sensation itself. That's not opposition. That's contamination, Khorne loathing Slaanesh not for what it does, but for what it turns violence into. Enead. If Slaanesh was born in the cataclysm of a fall, Enead is growing in the quiet machinery of every single Craftworld right now, in the exact moment an Eldar dies and their spirit stone feeds the infinity circuit. Where Slaanesh reaches across the galaxy to devour, Enead accumulates silently, galaxy-spanning but invisible, building power from the one resource the Aeldari have in inexhaustible supply, their own dead. The prophecies call it Caelus Varalanthian, the death god yet to be, a deity that does not yet exist but whose birth is being counted backwards toward the moment of its awakening. The infinity circuits are not merely soul vaults. They are a god's nervous system under construction, each spirit stone a neuron in a consciousness distributed across every Craftworld from Bieltan to Iyanden to Lugganath. As Eldar die, and they die constantly, hunted by the Imperium, consumed by Slaanesh, killed by the Tyranids, worn down by 13,000 years of war, their essence flows into the circuits, and Enead grows. It is not a god who demands worship. It is a god who demands death, who needs the Eldar race to die in order to be born, and who will be powerful enough to destroy she who thirsts only when there is no one left to die. The Ynnari, the Reborn, serve as Enead's missionaries in a very literal sense. They are the conduit through which the nascent god speaks, the hand of Enead manifesting in the material realm before the god itself has risen. They channel its power to resurrect the dead, to pull spirits from the warp before Slaanesh can consume them, to offer Eldar souls a path that does not lead through the maw. What looks like a religious movement is actually a logistics system for a god being born, and every soul the Ynnari rescue is a brick in the foundation of a power that will eventually outweigh the Prince of Pleasure. The critical moment, the ritual at Coheria in 999. M41 attempted to accelerate this slow accumulation into something the galaxy could feel. Eldrad Ulthran led a ceremony at Coheria designed to anchor Enead's consciousness into reality, to pull forward the end times prophecy, and meet Slaanesh on even terms before the remaining Eldar were all consumed. The ritual succeeded in establishing a beacon, a signal that Enead can hear and respond to, but a beacon is not a body. The god is still not here. It is still growing, It is still waiting for the last Eldar to die so it can finally stand. Init is not what most people think it is. The common assumption that Init is simply a death god who will fight Slaanesh and win when fully awakened misses the actual mechanism entirely. Init doesn't need to defeat Slaanesh through combat. Yud represents the cycle of resurrection and rebirth that Slaanesh cannot touch, a power prophesied to rise when the last Eldar falls, and whose awakening is said to spell doom for she who thirsts. Every spirit stone ever placed was not just a tomb. It was a weapon in a war being fought across 10,000 years.